She hit the ground before anyone understood what was happening. Wilhelmina Carver had been standing at the double oak doors of the First Presbyterian Church of Caldwell, Kansas, her white dress pressed and starched, her dark hair pinned beneath a veil that caught the August wind like a sail, and then she simply was not standing anymore. The sound her body made when it met the wooden steps was soft, almost private, like a secret the earth was keeping. The crowd of nearly 60 people gathered in the church courtyard froze in a collective paralysis that lasted exactly 3 heartbeats too long. The groom, Randall Coate, stood at the altar inside and did not move. The preacher, Reverend Hollis, gripped his Bible tighter and looked at the floor. The women in their Sunday best clutched their fans and stared. The men shifted their weight from boot to boot and looked sideways at one another, each waiting for someone else to be the one responsible. Marshal Joseph Shelby moved. He had been standing at the far edge of the churchyard, 20 feet back, no invitation in his pocket, no reason to be there that he could have explained to anyone who asked. His badge caught the sunlight as he crossed the distance between himself and the fallen woman in 6 long, deliberate strides. He went down on one knee beside her, one broad hand pressing gently to her jaw to turn her face from the step, his other hand checking the pulse at her throat with the practiced calm of a man who had seen far worse and refused to flinch at any of it. "Someone get water," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the particular quality of authority that made people move without thinking. A young boy ran. A woman found her smelling salts. But every conscious person in that courtyard understood, in the marrow-deep way that small towns understand things, that something fundamental had just shifted. The marshal had moved when no one else had. The groom had not. That single fact would echo through Caldwell for months, would plant itself in the story of 2 people like a seed dropped into cracked ground after a long drought, and it would grow into something neither of them had planned, had asked for, or had the first earthly idea how to survive. But to understand what Wilhelmina Carver was doing on those church steps in a dress she had never wanted to wear, and why Marshal Joseph Shelby had been standing at the edge of a wedding he had no business attending, you had to go back to the beginning. You had to go back to the letter. Wilhelmina had arrived in Caldwell on a Wednesday in late June of 1884 aboard the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway with a single trunk, $22, a photograph of a man she had never met, and a level of quiet desperation she would not have admitted to God himself. She was 26 years old, which in the language of the Eastern newspapers that ran the advertisements was simply described as a woman of suitable age, meaning she was old enough that people back home in Cincinnati had started to whisper. She had answered the advertisement herself. She had been the one to write the letter, to choose the words carefully, to fold the paper and seal it and walk to the post office before she could change her mind. She had done all of this with the full understanding that it was a transaction, that what was being exchanged was labor and loneliness on both sides, that the word love was not one that sensible people used in relation to arrangements made through correspondence. Randall Coate had seemed sensible enough in his letters. He was a landowner, which meant he had money or had once had it. He ran cattle, which meant he worked or had once worked. He was 34, which meant he was established. His letters were polite and grammatically correct, and revealed almost nothing about who he actually was as a human being, which at the time Wilhelmina had taken as a sign of restraint rather than emptiness. Caldwell itself was everything she had expected and nothing she had wanted. It was a border town, sitting right at the edge of the Cherokee Strip, dusty and loud and transient in the way all cattle towns were transient, full of people who were either passing through on their way to somewhere better or who had simply stopped running and decided to stay. The main street had a hotel, 2 saloons, a general store, a post office, a telegraph office, a jail, and the church. There was also a marshal's office, which was where she first saw Joseph Shelby, though she did not know his name then and would not have expected to need it. She had been walking with Randall from the train station to the hotel, Randall carrying her trunk with a kind of ostentatious effort that was meant to imply he was a generous man, when she had looked across the street and seen a tall figure standing in the doorway of the marshal's office, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, watching the street with the particular alertness of someone who was never truly at rest. He was not a beautiful man, not in any conventional sense. His face was angular and sun-darkened, with lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years squinting into bright distances. He wore his badge on a plain dark vest, no adornment, no showmanship to it. His hat was pulled low, but there was something about the way he occupied the space of that doorway, something about the deliberate stillness of him that made Wilhelmina look twice. He had been looking at her when she looked back. Their eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds across the dusty width of Main Street, and then she had looked away, and Randall had said something about the hotel, and she had answered him, and that was all it was. That was the whole of it. 2 seconds across a street in a cattle town in the middle of a Kansas summer. She had told herself it meant nothing, and she had nearly convinced herself of that. Randall Coates' house was 3 miles outside of town on a parcel of land that was large in acreage and barren in almost every other sense. The main house was wood-framed and serviceable, furnished in the way that a man furnishes a house when he has given no thought to anyone living in it except himself. There was a kitchen table with 1 chair. There was a bed in the main bedroom and a cot in the back room. There were no curtains on any window. Wilhelmina spent her first week in Caldwell in the hotel, which was the agreed arrangement, and she spent those 7 days doing what she had always done when she was frightened. She made herself useful. She helped Mrs. Clara Dunbar, who ran the hotel, with the laundry. She mended 2 shirts that belonged to a traveling salesman who did not ask her to, and was startled but grateful when she handed them back clean and repaired. She sat in the church on Sunday morning and sang the hymns she knew, and she watched the town around her with the careful eyes of a woman who had learned early that the difference between surviving a place and being destroyed by it was how quickly you understood its rules. The rules of Caldwell were not complicated. There was a hierarchy, and it ran on money and land first, reputation second, and gender last. Women did not run businesses. Women did not speak in town meetings. Women did not eat alone in the saloon or walk unescorted after dark, or make any decision that could be categorized as consequential without first consulting the nearest available man. Wilhelmina had grown up in Cincinnati with a schoolteacher mother and no father to speak of, which meant she had been raised to believe that women were capable of anything, and that the world would nonetheless punish them for acting on that belief. She was educated, which in Caldwell counted for almost nothing. She was sharp, which in Caldwell was described by the men as opinionated, and by the women as brave, poor thing. She did not meet Joseph Shelby properly until her 4th day in town, and it happened because of a horse. She had been walking back from the general store, carrying a small parcel of writing paper and a tin of peppermint drops, when a horse tied to the post outside the saloon pulled its reins free and began moving in her direction with the kind of random, indifferent energy that frightened animals display when they are not frightened enough to run but too unsettled to stand still. She did not panic. She had been around horses in Ohio, had even ridden, though not well. She raised her free hand, spoke to the animal quietly, and was in the process of reaching for its bridle when someone else reached it first. The marshal's hand closed around the leather just above hers, and she became aware of him the way you become aware of a fire when you are standing close enough to feel it rather than see it. He was even taller than he had appeared from across the street. "That's Dawson's horse," he said. "He pulls free if you tie him with a half hitch. You need a clove hitch on this post." "I was not planning to tie him permanently," she said. "I was planning to walk him to the next post and attach him more securely." He looked at her with the kind of quiet assessment that was not rude but was thorough. "That would have worked too," he said. "I know," she said. He tied the horse with a clove hitch and turned to look at her fully, and she did not look away the way she had across the street. She met his eyes, which were a gray that shifted toward green in the direct sunlight, and she saw something in them she had not expected. He was not looking at her the way men in Caldwell looked at women, which was to say he was not looking at her as though she were a piece of property or a problem or a pleasant view. He was looking at her as though she were a person, which sounds like a small thing and was not. "You're the coat woman," he said. "My name is Wilhelmina Carver," she said. "I have not yet become anyone's woman." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile but in the neighborhood of one. "Joseph Shelby," he said. "I run the law in this town." "I know what a marshal's badge is," she said. "I expect you know a lot of things," he said, and there was nothing condescending in it. It sounded like an observation he had made and found genuinely interesting. She walked back to the hotel with her writing paper and her peppermint drops, and she thought about the way he had said her name back to her. Not Coat, not the Coat woman, but Wilhelmina Carver, as though it mattered that the name belonged to her before it belonged to anyone else. She thought about it more than she should have, and she knew she was thinking about it too much, and she kept thinking about it anyway. Her second meeting with Randall Coat, 3 days before the official wedding date, told her everything she had been afraid to know. She had ridden out to the house to begin arranging it, which was the stated purpose, and the actual purpose was that she was trying to construct for herself some version of the future that felt livable. She brought a bolt of pale blue fabric for curtains. She brought seeds for a kitchen garden, which she had purchased at the general store with her own money. She brought a cooking pot that was better than the dented one she had found in his kitchen. Randall was not home when she arrived, which had been agreed, as he had business in town. She spent 2 hours measuring windows and pulling weeds from what might become a garden plot and making small mental notes about what could be fixed and what could be endured and what could not be either. She was in the kitchen when she heard voices, and she understood from the particular tone of them that they were not meant to be heard. Randall came in through the back door with a man she recognized as his foreman, a broad, sunburned man named Tate, and they were mid-conversation, and neither of them saw her standing at the far end of the kitchen until it was too late. "You don't need to manage her," Tate was saying. "She'll do what she's told once she's here permanent. That's what they're for." "It's the land I needed cleared up," Randall said, and then he saw her and his face shifted from open to closed in the space of a single breath. "Mina," he said, which was a name she had not given him permission to use. "I didn't know you were here. I came to measure the windows," she said. The silence that followed was the kind that had too much in it. Tate looked at the floor. Randall looked at her with the calculating expression of a man deciding how much damage had been done. "The land I needed cleared up," he had said, "not the house, not the life, the land." Later, sitting on the wagon back toward town, she tried to be fair about it. She tried to consider that men said things to other men that they did not mean entirely, that the pressure of running a cattle operation was real and not pretty, that she had arrived with expectations that had no basis in what they had actually promised each other. She tried very hard to be reasonable about the fact that she might have made a catastrophic mistake. She was still trying to be reasonable about it when she passed the marshal's office and saw the lamp burning inside, and saw through the window the shadow of Joseph Shelby sitting at his desk with his head bent over what appeared to be paperwork, and she told herself firmly to keep walking. She kept walking. But she thought about him again that night, lying in the hotel bed with the sound of the street below drifting up through the thin walls, and she recognized the thought for what it was, which was inconvenient and dangerous, and absolutely not something she could afford. She was 3 days from a wedding that was going to happen whether she had discovered she was being managed or not, because the alternative was returning to Cincinnati with $20 and nowhere to live, and no more options than she had left behind. This was the kind of forced choice that the world made for women in 1884, and Wilhelmina knew it with the bone-deep clarity of someone who had never had the luxury of pretending otherwise. She went to the wedding. She put on the dress. She walked to the church. She did not faint because she was delicate or weak or prone to dramatic gestures. She fainted because it was the last day of August in southern Kansas, and she had not eaten that morning, and she had been standing in the heat in a dress with a corset pulled 3 inches tighter than comfortable, because the dress had been made for a version of her that did not eat when she was frightened, and the combination of heat and hunger, and the specific quality of dread that had been building in her chest for 3 days chose that exact moment to collect all its debts at once. She felt the world tilt. She felt the wooden steps under her feet become uncertain. She thought, with the strange clarity of the last conscious moment before darkness, that she had never once been able to afford a single choice that was purely her own. And then the ground came up to meet her. She came back to herself in pieces. First the sound, which was the collective murmur of 60 people who had recovered from their paralysis and were now doing what crowds do, which is talk. Then the smell, which was August and hoarse, and the sharp, clean bite of smelling salts someone was waving under her nose. Then the feel, which was a broad hand turned palm up beneath her head, lifting it just enough from the wood of the step that her skull was not resting on hard surface. Then she opened her eyes and Joseph Shelby was there. He was close, closer than he had any socially sanctioned reason to be, crouched beside her with one hand supporting her head and the other resting at her shoulder without quite touching it, the way you hold your hands near something fragile without presuming to grip it. His face was expressionless in the careful way that faces are expressionless when the person behind them is working very hard to remain composed. "Can you hear me?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Can you tell me your name?" "You already know my name," she said, the line of his mouth softened by a fraction. "That's a good sign," he said. Behind him, she could see Reverend Hollis making his way down the church steps with his black coat flapping, and Clara Dunbar from the hotel pushing through the crowd with a cup of water, and the crowd itself pressing forward with the urgent concern of people who had been frightened and were now relieved and wanted credit for the relief. And in the doorway of the church, some distance back and utterly stationary, stood Randall Coate. He had not come down the steps. He was watching from the doorway with his hands loose at his sides, and an expression on his face that was not alarm and was not love, and was not the way a man looks at a woman he intends to protect. Wilhelmina saw it. She saw it from the ground, with her head cradled in a stranger's hand, and something that had been holding itself together inside her finally let go. "I cannot marry him," she said. She was not speaking to anyone in particular. She was saying it to the open sky, or to the ground, or to the part of herself that had known it all along, and had not had the courage to say it out loud until she was lying down and had no more angles to maintain. Joseph Shelby heard her. He was the only one close enough to hear her. He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched something work through the gray-green of his eyes, some private calculation or decision, and then he said very quietly, "Then don't." "I have no money," she said. "I have no arrangement. I came out here with $20 and a contract." "I know," he said. "You don't know anything about me," she said. "I know your name belongs to you," he said. "And I know you are going to walk that horse to the next post." Clara Dunbar arrived with the water, and the moment of strange intimacy broke apart the way moments do, dissolving back into the ordinary world with its crowds and its obligations and its many, many people who had opinions about what came next. Wilhelmina sat up with Clara's help and drank the water and said she was fine. She was quite fine. It was the heat. It was nothing. Please stop looking at her like that. Randall came down the steps eventually. He offered her his arm, and she took it because she needed something to stand up with, and there was nothing else available. He said the right things, the concerned things, but she was watching his hands, and his hands were doing that very slightly impatient thing that hands do when the person attached to them is waiting for a situation to be resolved. She did not marry him that day. She had fainted, and it was the heat, and the sensible thing to do was wait until she had recovered, and Reverend Hollis agreed, and Randall could not in public object to waiting until his bride had recovered from a fainting spell, without appearing to be the kind of man even Caldwell's charitable interpretation could not excuse. She went back to the hotel. She lay on her bed and she stared at the ceiling and she thought very carefully about the problem she was in. The problem had a number of components. Component 1. She had no money to leave Caldwell and no clear destination if she did leave. Component 2. The arrangement with Randall, however unromantic, was the arrangement she had made, and breaking it would leave her with nothing. Component 3. There was a marshal's badge in her very recent memory attached to a pair of gray-green eyes and a pair of hands that had held her head with more gentleness than anyone had used with her in longer than she could honestly recall. The third component was the most dangerous one, and she knew it. Joseph Shelby did not come to the hotel. He had no reason to. His professional obligation to the woman who had fainted in the churchyard had been discharged the moment she was upright and breathing normally, and anything beyond that was not within the scope of his duties. He went back to his office, and he sat down at his desk, and he did not do the paperwork that was waiting for him. He was 31 years old, and he had been Marshal of Caldwell for 4 years, which was long enough to know the town's darkest corners and the people who inhabited them. He had come to Caldwell from Missouri after a period of his life he did not discuss in detail with anyone, a period that involved a war that was technically over, but had left its damage running silent and deep in him like a river underground. He had made himself useful here. He had been consistent and honest and not cruel. He was respected in the way that men who are reliable in dangerous situations are respected, which is to say genuinely but with a certain cautious distance, because the people who depend on someone's reliability are also aware that a reliable man has seen things that change a person. He had not thought seriously about a woman in several years. He had decided, not in a dramatic way but in a quiet, final way, that his life was the shape it was going to be. There was a dog that slept on the porch of the office and came in for meals. There was the work. There was the Sunday morning service which he attended partly from habit and partly because the singing helped something in him that nothing else helped. There was a good horse. It was enough. He had been at the edge of that churchyard because he had received an anonymous note 3 days before the wedding that said only, "Ask Coate about the Harlan deed." He was a lawman. He could not ignore anonymous notes about property deeds. He had been watching Randall Coate the way he always watched people who had something in their past that required watching, which was to say carefully, and from a distance that looked like disinterest. He had watched Randall Coate not move when his bride hit the ground. He had noted it with the particular precision with which he noted things that mattered. And he had not been able to stop thinking about Wilhelmina Carver's voice when she had said from the ground that she could not marry him. On the 3rd day after the fainting, Wilhelmina came to his office. She knocked on the open door because the door was open, and knocking on an open door is the kind of small courtesy that costs nothing and signals everything about the kind of person you are, which is to say the kind of person who was raised to be decent even when decency is inconvenient. He looked up from his desk, and she was standing in the frame with the morning sun behind her, not in white this time, but in a plain brown dress that fit her without artifice, and her hair was down around her shoulders because it was early and she had not yet put it up, and she looked more like herself than she had in the churchyard, whatever herself meant for a woman he barely knew. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Come in," he said. She came in and stood in front of his desk with her hands folded and her spine straight in the way that people hold themselves when they are scared but determined not to show it. He waited. "You said something to me," she said. "When I was on the ground, you said then don't." "I remember," he said. "Did you mean it as a real statement," she said, "or did you mean it the way people say things when they are trying to be comforting?" He considered this honestly. "I meant it both ways," he said, "but mostly as a real statement." "I need to understand what then don't looks like practically speaking," she said. "Because I have $20 and a trunk and a train ticket that goes back to somewhere I cannot go back to, and in this town I have no standing and no employment, and in approximately 4 days Randall Coate is going to expect an answer about rescheduling the wedding." "What work can you do?" he said. She blinked. She had not expected the conversation to move directly to practicalities, and the fact that it did seemed to both surprise and steady her. "I can teach," she said. "I have a formal education. I can sew and cook and keep accounts. I can read and write in English and in French. I can set type if there is a printing operation. I am, I should tell you, quite competent." "The school here has no teacher," he said. "The last one left in May." "I know," she said. "Clara Dunbar told me. The town council runs the school," he said. "They'd need to approve a hire. They meet on Thursday." "That's 4 days," she said. "It is," he said. "And the pay," she said. $40 a month," he said. "And the use of the schoolhouse living quarters." She was quiet for a moment, doing the math in her head that he could see her doing. "Would you speak to them?" she said. "About the teaching position. I do not think my own endorsement carries much weight here yet, and yours does." It was not a small thing she was asking. A marshal vouching for a woman who had just declined to marry one of the town's established landowners was a political action with consequences he would need to manage. She knew that. He could see that she knew it and was asking anyway because she was in the position of having no good options, only a range of bad ones. "I'll speak to them," he said. She exhaled slowly, a breath she had been holding for some time. "Thank you," she said, and then, because she was the kind of person she was, "Why?" He met her eyes across the desk. "Because you were going to walk that horse to the next post," he said, "and nobody taught you that. You figured it out yourself." She looked at him for a long moment with an expression he could not fully read. "That is a very strange reason," she said. "It's the real one," he said. She left, and he went back to his desk, and he sat for a full minute with his hands flat on the wood before he picked up his pen and started writing. The Harlan deed turned out to be a dark story that required careful unraveling. Joseph spent the better part of 3 days pulling at the threads, visiting the land records office, speaking quietly to a few people who knew things they had not volunteered, and building a picture he had suspected but needed to confirm. Randall Coate had acquired 2 sections of adjoining land through a foreclosure that was, on close examination, not entirely clean. The previous owner, a farmer named Elias Harlan, had died in the spring, and his widow had signed the deed transfer under what several witnesses described as significant pressure, though pressure in 1884 was a word that covered a large range of things that were legal and several things that were not. The widow Harlan, a woman named Ruth, was now living with her sister in Wichita. Joseph wrote her a letter. The letter came back with an answer that confirmed what he had suspected, and it also told him something else, which was that Randall Coate had been expecting a woman from back east, not because he was lonely, but because the land he had accumulated now required more management than he could do alone. And a wife, particularly one who came from somewhere far away and had no local connections, was less expensive and more controllable than a foreman. He sat with this information for a day, because it had implications, and implications required thinking about before acting. Then he went to the town council meeting on Thursday and spoke on behalf of Wilhelmina Carver's application for the teaching position with the measured, factual endorsement of a man who did not overstate things, which meant people believed him completely. The council voted 4-1 to hire her, the one dissenting vote coming from a man named George Pratt, who was Randall Coate's cousin, and whose objection was noted and ignored. He went to the hotel afterward and knocked on her door, and told her through the wood that she had the position. There was a pause, and then she opened the door and she looked at him with eyes that were brighter than usual, and she said, "Thank you, Marshal Shelby," very formally, and then said, "I have peppermint drops if you would like one," which was so unexpected and so entirely characteristic of her that he laughed. It was a short laugh, slightly rusty from underuse, but it was a real one. She gave him a peppermint drop. He ate it in the hallway outside her hotel room door, and they stood there for a moment with nothing particular to say, and everything particular happening nonetheless. Randall Coate's reaction to the news that Wilhelmina was not going to reschedule the wedding was not pleasant, but it stayed within bounds that were legal because Joseph made a point of being visible on Main Street that afternoon with his badge catching the sun, and his expression carrying the calm, unambiguous message that certain kinds of behavior would not be tolerated in his jurisdiction. Randall came to the marshal's office the following morning and made a variety of statements that ranged from aggrieved to threatening, and Joseph listened to all of them with the patience of a man who has heard most varieties of human complaint, and responded with the equal patience of a man explaining the law to someone who would prefer the law to be different than it is. She made a contractual agreement, Randall said. She made a social arrangement that was not a legal contract, Joseph said. She owes you nothing she hasn't paid you. Has she taken money from you? She came out here on my invitation, Randall said. She came out here on a train ticket she purchased herself, Joseph said. He knew this because he had asked Clara Dunbar, who knew everything. She stayed at the hotel and paid for her own room. She owes you nothing. I know what you're doing, Randall said, and his voice had changed into something harder and less civil. I'm explaining the law, Joseph said. You're interested in her yourself, Randall said. Everyone can see it. The marshal moves when nobody else does and thinks nobody notices what that means. Joseph held Randall's gaze steadily. What I notice, he said, is that you did not move, and everyone saw that too. Randall left. Joseph understood that this was not the end of it. Men like Randall did not accept being refused without finding some way to reestablish their standing, and the method they chose was usually either legal maneuvering or something that required a marshal's attention. He made note of it and kept watch. Wilhelmina moved into the schoolhouse living quarters on a Saturday, which was a small room off the back of the main schoolroom with a window that faced east and a cast-iron stove that worked once you cleaned the flue, which she did herself on her first morning, emerging sooty-faced and triumphant with a clean flue, and the stove burning cleanly, and a pot of coffee on for the first time in a space that was purely hers. She walked through the schoolroom and made lists of what was needed: slates, chalk, a new geography primer, firewood for the coming winter. She wrote the lists in the neat, precise hand of a woman who had been trained to produce legible writing and had since transformed it into a tool she relied on. She sent the lists to the council and she began preparing her first lessons. The school had 12 enrolled students ranging from 7 to 15, and they arrived on her first Monday morning in a state of cautious assessment that she recognized from years of being assessed herself, and she met it the same way she had always met it, which was by being direct and interesting, and not pretending the situation was simpler than it was. "My name is Miss Carver," she said. "I am your teacher. I do not know everything, and if I tell you something that turns out to be wrong, I expect you to tell me so, and I will tell you the same." They stared at her. Then a boy in the second row raised his hand. "Are you the one who fainted at the coat wedding?" he said. "I am," she said. "I fainted because it was very hot and I had not eaten breakfast. The lesson here is that breakfast is important, which means it is also your parents' responsibility to ensure you have it before coming to school. Are there any other questions?" There were not. They got to work. She found her footing in the classroom quickly, which did not surprise her. What surprised her was how much she liked Caldwell when she was in it as herself rather than as someone's prospective wife. She liked the morning walk to the general store for supplies. She liked Clara Dunbar's company over tea on Tuesday evenings. She liked the particular quality of the Kansas sky in September, which was high and wide, and a shade of blue that made a person understand why painters went mad trying to capture it. She did not allow herself to think about Joseph Shelby more than was warranted by the fact that he was the person who had helped her, except that she thought about him considerably more than that, and was honest with herself about it, even while she told herself firmly that acting on it would be the height of impracticality. He was, after all, a man with a dark past he had not disclosed. He was a man who wore a badge in a town that occasionally required the badge to be used. He was a man whose daily existence included a degree of danger that Wilhelmina, having grown up in a city with problems that were at least legible, found difficult to calibrate against her own risk tolerance. But he had moved when no one else had moved. He had said her name belonged to her. He had eaten a peppermint drop in a hotel hallway and laughed a real laugh, and she could not make herself stop thinking about either of those things. He came to the schoolhouse on a Tuesday in late September, not during school hours but in the late afternoon after the students had gone, and he brought firewood, which he stacked neatly against the side of the building without being asked. She heard the sound of it and came to the door and watched him work for a moment before he heard her and straightened and turned. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "The council was slow about it," he said, "and the nights are getting cold." She looked at the neat stack of wood and then at him. "You're looking after me," she said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation with something careful and questioning underneath it. "I'm looking after the school's investment in a good teacher," he said, which was the kind of answer that was technically accurate and completely dishonest at the same time. "Marshal Shelby," she said. "Miss Carver," he said. They looked at each other in the cooling late September air, and the honesty between them was so palpable she could have put her hand on it. "Would you like coffee?" she said. "I made it 10 minutes ago and I hate to drink it alone." He came inside. He sat at one of the small student desks because it was the only furniture available in the schoolroom, which meant he was folded into a chair that was designed for a 12-year-old, and the absurdity of this seemed to strike him as funny and he allowed it to, sitting there with his long legs folded up at an improbable angle and accepting the coffee she brought him. "Tell me something true," she said. She had seated herself at her teacher's desk across from him, which meant she was looking at a large man in a small chair who was holding a tin coffee mug with both hands, and the image was simultaneously undignified and deeply comfortable. "That's a significant request," he said. "I know," she said. "But we've been doing the practical version of this, the firewood and the council meeting and the professional courtesies, and I think we both know that's not the whole of it. So tell me something true." He considered for a moment. Then he said, "I was in the war, on the Union side. I was 17 when I enlisted, which is legal but not sensible, and I saw things that I spent a number of years afterward trying to understand how to carry. I came to Caldwell because it was far from Missouri, and because being useful to a town seemed like a better way to carry those things than the alternative, which was to carry them alone." She listened to this with her full attention, the kind of attention that does not calculate or perform but simply receives. "What is the alternative?" she said. "Drinking," he said, "or worse." "But you chose useful," she said. "I chose useful," he said. "I chose useful too," she said. "I came here because I was practical about my circumstances, and being practical meant making an arrangement that turned out to be hollow, which was a failure of my practical reasoning. And I have been thinking about that failure more than I should. And then I think about the fact that you moved and no one else did. And I think about the fact that the reason you moved was not because it was your job, but because you were already watching, and I think," she stopped. "Tell me something true," he said, turning it back to her. She looked at him across the small room that smelled of chalk and coffee and wood smoke. "I think you might be the most honest person I have encountered since I arrived in this state," she said, "and I do not know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "You've been here 2 months. You're building something here. That's enough for right now." "Is it enough for you?" she said. He set down the coffee mug on the edge of the small desk, which was too small to comfortably support it, and looked at her with the gray-green eyes that did not perform anything but simply showed what was in them. "No," he said honestly, "but I've been patient before." She felt something warm and complicated move through her chest, and she looked down at her own hands for a moment because looking at him while she was feeling it seemed like too much to manage all at once. "I need time," she said. "Take it," he said. He finished his coffee. He thanked her. He walked back to his office in the October dusk, and she stood in the schoolroom doorway and watched him go and told herself that she was being sensible and careful, and that sensible and careful were virtues, and also that she was almost entirely certain she was falling in love with him, which was neither sensible nor careful and was happening anyway. The trouble with Randall Coate did not go away. In November, Wilhelmina came home from the general store to find a note tucked under the schoolhouse door that told her, in Randall's tight, controlled handwriting, that he intended to speak to the town council about the circumstances of her departure from their arrangement, implying that the circumstances reflected poorly on her character. It was the kind of letter that did not say anything specific enough to be actionable, but communicated its threat perfectly well. She took it to Joseph's office the next morning. He read it without expression, which she had come to understand meant he was thinking hard rather than feeling nothing. He set it down on the desk. "He's trying to frighten you," he said. "I know," she said. "Is it working?" "Is it?" he said. She considered. "A little," she said, "but mostly I'm angry." "Good," he said. "That's the right response." He looked at the note again. "I've been building a case about the Harlan land. The widow Harlan has agreed to make a formal statement. When I bring this to the circuit judge, which I expect to do in January, Randall Coate is going to have significantly larger problems than you." She absorbed this. "You've been investigating him," she said. "Since before you arrived," he said. "He's been doing things in this county that need looking at. Your situation was separate from that." "But related," she said. "Related," he said. "He wanted a woman from back east because she'd have no standing here," she said, thinking it through. "No family, no connections, no one to complain to if things went wrong." "That's what Ruth Harlan's letter suggested," he said. She sat with this for a moment. The knowledge of how close she had come to being precisely the kind of invisible, isolated woman that Randall had been counting on acquiring made something cold move through her that she pushed away because cold fear was not useful. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "You deserve to know the full shape of it," he said. She looked at him and he looked at her, and in the drafty marshal's office with the smell of wood smoke and oiled leather and the sound of the street outside, she thought about dark pasts and hidden motives, and the particular kind of courage it took to be useful in the face of things that would have destroyed a lesser person. "Joseph," she said, and his name in her mouth felt like the first time she had said it, even though she had used it in her head many times. He went very still. "I have taken the time you said to take," she said, "and I would like you to walk with me on Sunday afternoon if that is something you are willing to do." He held her gaze, and something in the set of his face softened in a way she had not seen before, a softening that was not weakness but was the opposite of the guard he kept, the letting down of something that had been held up for a long time. "I'm willing," he said. She stood up and straightened her skirt with the small decisive gesture that meant she had resolved a question and was moving on, and she walked to the door and stopped. "I will bring peppermint drops," she said. "I'll look forward to it," he said. The Sunday walk turned into a habit. They walked along the creek south of town, where the cottonwood trees had lost their leaves and the water ran clear and cold over its stone bed, and they talked. This was the part of falling in love that she had not anticipated from a man whose public face was made of measured words and professional calm, which was that once Joseph Shelby started talking to her, he did not stop easily, and what he said was always something real. He told her about Missouri, about the particular green of it in summer, and how he had not been back since the war, and was not sure he ever would be because the place he remembered and the place it was now were two different countries inside the same borders. She told him about Cincinnati, about her mother who had taught Latin to children who thought they did not need it and had been right and wrong about that at the same time. She told him about her father who had left when she was 8, which she described simply as a fact, and he received simply as a fact without pity, which was the exact right way to receive it. He told her about the year he had come back from the war and had spent 6 months in a state that he described carefully as not entirely being present in his own life, and how a man in Missouri had handed him a badge one morning and said, "You're good in a crisis, boy," and that had been the end of that particular dark period. She told him about the day she had sat down and written the mail-order advertisement response, how she had done it in her best handwriting, and with full knowledge that it was a diminishment, and had done it anyway because the alternative was to keep diminishing in a city that had stopped seeing her. He listened to this with the particular quality of attention he gave everything she said, which was complete. It was during the fourth Sunday walk, when the first snow of winter was threatening on the horizon, and they had walked farther than usual without noticing, that he reached over and took her hand. It was not a grand gesture. He simply extended his hand, and she placed hers in it, and they kept walking along the frozen creek bank, with their breath making small clouds in the cold air, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there was nothing that needed saying at that particular moment. The cold was sharp and clean, and the sky above was the deep gray of an approaching storm, and Wilhelmina Carver was holding the hand of the Marshal of Caldwell, Kansas, on a Sunday afternoon in late November of 1884, and for the first time since she had stepped off that train in June, she felt something that was not managing or surviving but was something else entirely. "Joseph," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am glad I fainted," she said. He squeezed her hand once firmly. "So am I," he said. Snow began to fall before they made it back to town, small dry flakes at first and then more of them, settling on the shoulders of his dark coat and in her hair, and they walked faster and arrived at the schoolhouse door laughing about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of wonderful, and he stood at her door for a moment in the falling snow before he kissed her very gently once on the forehead, which was not what she had expected and was somehow more affecting than anything more dramatic would have been. She went inside. She leaned against the inside of the schoolhouse door in the warm room with her heart doing something undignified in her chest, and her lips curved in a smile she could not have suppressed if she had tried, and she did not try. January came with the circuit judge. Joseph presented the Harlan case with the meticulous documentation he had spent 6 months assembling, and Ruth Harlan's statement was read into the record, and 3 other parties whose lands had been subject to similar pressure from Randall Coate and his associates came forward, because the judge being present gave them the safety to do what they had not felt safe doing before. The proceedings were not fast, but they were thorough, and at the end of them, Randall Coate was facing charges of fraudulent land acquisition that would tie him up in the territorial courts for years and ultimately result in the return of the Harlan land to its rightful heirs. He did not go to prison immediately, which frustrated Wilhelmina when she heard it, and Joseph had to explain to her the particular slowness of territorial legal proceedings in a way that made her understand, if not accept, that the law moved at its own pace regardless of anyone's sense of justice. "He'll face it," Joseph said. "These things take time, but they hold." "I know," she said. "I just want there to be a moment where he understands what he did. Not punishment, understanding. Those are 2 different things," he said. "I know that too," she said. She looked at him across the kitchen table of the schoolhouse, where they had fallen into the habit of sharing Sunday dinners, she cooking and he providing whatever the general store had that week, and she said, "How do you do it? Carry the weight of all of it, the law and the cases and the knowing things that other people don't have to know." He was quiet for a moment. "The same way you do it," he said, "by paying attention to what's right in front of me." She looked at him steadily. "What's right in front of you?" She said, "You," he said. She covered his hand with hers on the table. "Yes," she said. In February, with the Kansas winter full and relentless outside the windows, Joseph Shelby did something he had not done with his full, deliberate intention in more years than he could precisely count. He planned. He thought about the future as a thing he was constructing rather than a thing that was happening to him. And the future he was thinking about had Wilhelmina Carver in it with a permanence that was not desperate or grasping, but was as solid and reliable as the ground. He did not rush it because she had asked for time, and because he understood that what she had barely escaped had been an arrangement made from desperation, and he would not have what he wanted with her unless what they built together was made from something different. He waited, and he was patient, and he was present. And he let the weeks of Sunday walks and shared dinners and long conversations by the stove do what they were doing, which was building something that did not need a name yet, but was becoming one. Spring came to Caldwell the way it always came to Kansas, violently and fast, with thunderstorms that rolled across the plains like something angry and left the air cleaned and electric in their wake. The schoolroom was loud with the sound of it one March evening, when he came with firewood they did not yet need for a season that had not yet ended, and she met him at the door, and they stood on the small covered porch together, watching the lightning move across the flats south of town. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "I want to ask you properly," he said, which made her turn and look at him. He was not a man who performed things, who arranged circumstances for effect or chose moments with theatrical calculation. He was simply present in the way he always was, direct and real, and slightly awkward in the way that honest people are slightly awkward when they say things they mean without protection. He reached into his coat and brought out a small object, which was a ring, plain silver, that he had bought from the jeweler in Wichita on a supply run, and carried in his pocket for 3 weeks while he figured out the right time, which he now decided was a thunderstorm because at least no one else was watching. "I am asking because I want to," he said. "Not because it's practical. Not because of circumstance. Because you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in my life, and I would like very much to spend the rest of it finding out what you think about things." He paused. "Wilhelmina Carver, will you marry me?" The lightning threw the whole plains into silver light for a long moment, and she looked at his face in it. The angular, honest face with the lines at the corners of his eyes and the gray-green gaze that never performed and never hid, and she said, "Yes," clearly and completely, and without hesitation. He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it for a moment, and then at him, and then she kissed him, not gently this time, but fully, with the accumulated weight of all the things they had been saying and not saying since August when she had opened her eyes on a church step and found him there. And he kissed her back with the same weight, and they stood on the schoolhouse porch in a Kansas thunderstorm with the lightning and the rain and the smell of the plains going green after winter, and neither of them thought about practical matters for a full minute, which for both of them was something close to unprecedented. They married in May. The same church, the same double oak doors, but entirely different circumstances. She wore a dress of deep blue, which was not traditional and was entirely characteristic of her, and she had eaten a full breakfast, and it was morning and not the sweltering height of August. Her hair was pinned up with small white wildflowers that the students had brought her that morning, all 12 of them waiting outside the schoolhouse at 7 in the morning with handfuls of whatever was blooming, which had made her cry in a way she had not anticipated. Joseph stood at the altar in his good coat with his badge left at the office because this was a Sunday, and this was his own occasion, and he had decided that his badge had no place in it. And she came through the double oak doors on her own, because there was no one to give her away, and she did not need anyone to give her away. And when she saw him standing there with the gray-green eyes and the real face, and the ring on his own hand that matched the one on hers, she walked toward him with the particular steadiness of a woman who knew exactly where she was going. Reverend Holly's married them with efficiency and genuine warmth, and the town came, even some of the people who had stood paralyzed in this same courtyard 9 months before and not moved when she fell. And she did not hold that against them, because she understood that fear and surprise were not moral failings, and that the measure of people was not what they did in the first 3 heartbeats, but what they did after. What the town of Caldwell did after, once the story of the marshal and the teacher settled into community knowledge, was to decide that they were something worth investing in. Clara Dunbar organized a reception at the hotel with food that could not possibly have fit in the hotel's kitchen, and must have involved every cook in town. George Pratt, Randall's cousin, showed up and shook Joseph's hand and said nothing about any of it, which was the most anyone could have expected. The 12 students from the schoolhouse sat in the front pew and were better behaved than they had been all year, which Wilhelmina would remind them of every subsequent spring when their behavior declined. She kept teaching. This was a condition she had stated clearly before the wedding, and Joseph had said, with the tone of a man who finds a condition so reasonable he is not sure why it requires stating, that of course she would keep teaching. Why would he have married a remarkable mind and then asked it to stop being used? She had looked at him with a warmth that she did not have words for and had kissed him, and that had been the end of the discussion. They moved into a house. Not Randall Coates' former property, which was by then tied up in legal proceedings, but a proper house on the east side of town that Joseph had been renting for the past 3 years, and that they now began to make into something together, she adding the curtains and the kitchen garden and the second chair at the table, he adding the large, reliable presence that made the house feel inhabited in a way that went beyond simply having a person in it. The dog from the marshal's office porch, whose name was Sergeant, moved into the house on the 3rd day of the marriage with the confidence of a creature who had known all along that this was the correct outcome and had simply been waiting for the humans to catch up. Summer came, and with it the particular rhythm of their life together, which was neither romantic novel nor quiet simplicity, but was specifically theirs. He rose early, and she rose early, and they had coffee in the kitchen before either of them started their day. And these mornings were the part of being married that she had not understood from the outside. The way the ordinary architecture of two people's hours fitted together to make a structure that was stronger than either of its components. She had students who needed her, and he had a town that needed him, and they came home to each other in the evenings with the full weight of their respective days, and they did not pretend those days were lighter than they were, which meant that when they talked about difficult things they talked about them honestly, and when they did not talk, they did not feel the pressure of silence as a problem to be solved. He told her more, gradually, about Missouri and the war and the dark period that had followed. She told him more about Cincinnati and her mother's careful poverty, and the particular loneliness of being an educated woman in a world that required educated women to pretend they were not, so that men around them would not feel diminished. He listened with the same complete attention he had always given her. She listened the same way back. In October, almost exactly a year after she had asked him to walk with her on a Sunday, she told him she was pregnant. She told him at the kitchen table over breakfast, directly, watching his face. His face did something she had not seen it do before, which was that all the careful, contained composure of it simply went away entirely for a long moment, replaced by something open and overwhelmed, and unguarded that she recognized, because she had felt it herself for the week she had known before telling him. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and he held them for a long time without speaking, and she understood that he was taking a minute to let the enormousness of it settle into him, and she gave him the minute without feeling the need to fill it. "Are you well?" he said finally. "I am well," she said. "We should tell Clara," he said. She laughed. "I thought you might say something more romantic first." "I love you more than I have words for," he said. "I have been planning on saying that for the rest of my life in ways that will occasionally be romantic and occasionally be practical. I just said the practical one first." She squeezed his hands. "I love you more than I have words for too," she said. "Now let's tell Clara." Clara Dunbar's reaction to the news was so enthusiastic that Wilhelmina was fairly certain the entire hotel heard it. And by the following morning the information had distributed itself through Caldwell with the speed and thoroughness of a well-organized fire, which meant that by the time she walked to the schoolhouse that Monday morning, 3 different women had offered her advice she had not requested, and one man had congratulated Joseph so vigorously in the street that his hat had fallen off. The pregnancy changed the rhythm of things in small ways, and not in the large ways that some people seem to expect. She kept teaching through February, which was further than several people thought sensible and exactly as far as she thought sensible, which was the usual relationship between her judgment and other people's opinions of it. She handed the school to a young woman named Frances Bligh, who had arrived in Caldwell the previous summer with a teaching certificate and an excellent grasp of mathematics. And this was both a practical necessity and something she managed to feel good about because Frances Bligh was going to be exactly the kind of teacher the students deserved. Joseph was, in the period of her pregnancy, the same person he had always been, with an additional layer of attentiveness that stopped just short of being smothering, because he had enough self-awareness to notice when he was edging toward it and pull back. He chopped firewood without being asked. He brought home things from the general store that she had not put on any list, but that were exactly what she wanted, which suggested he had either been paying close attention for a year or was operating on some intuitive frequency she found both touching and slightly uncanny. He did not treat her as fragile. He treated her as a person doing something demanding and kept the practical scaffolding of their life running smoothly so that she could do it. Their son was born in April of 1886. April was a reasonable time to be born in Kansas if you were going to be born, because the worst of winter was past and the worst of summer had not arrived, and the light was clear and generous. The birth was attended by Clara, who had experience in these matters, and a doctor named Walter Pierce, who had set up practice in Caldwell the previous fall, and whose presence made Joseph slightly less out of his mind with worry, which was the closest he ever came to losing his composure entirely. When it was over and she was lying in the bedroom with the baby against her chest and Joseph sitting on the edge of the bed beside her with a face that looked like a man who has just survived something enormous and is still deciding what to do about it, she said, "He has your eyes." Joseph looked at the baby with the gray-green gaze and then at her and said, "He has your chin and your expression. He looks like he's already decided something." "Babies frequently do," she said. They named him Thomas, which was Joseph's middle name and had been his grandfather's first name, and which Wilhelmina approved because it was a strong, solid name that would not be heavy for a child to carry. Thomas Shelby, born April 1886 in Caldwell, Kansas, to a teacher and a marshal who had arrived at each other by a route that included a church step, a horse post, and a substantial quantity of peppermint drops. The first year of Thomas's life was full in the way that years with small children are full, which is to say densely populated with things that are demanding and exhausting, and also, quite regularly, so beautiful they were difficult to look at directly. He was a healthy, alert child with opinions about nearly everything, which Wilhelmina had expected, and a tendency to look at things for long, concentrated periods before reaching for them, which she recognized as a quality she had seen before in someone else. She went back to teaching when Thomas was 8 months old, which Clara declared too soon, and Joseph said nothing about because he had learned by then that saying nothing and offering practical support was the correct response to Wilhelmina making a decision he had no standing to override. And Frances Bligh, who had been keeping the school, became her full-time teaching partner instead of a replacement, which doubled the school's capacity and brought in students from farms farther out who had previously been too far to attend regularly. Caldwell in 1887 was a different town than the one she had arrived in. The cattle drives that had defined it through the late 1870s and early 1880s were declining as the railheads moved, and the long drives became less economical, and the town was going through the particular transformation of a frontier settlement, deciding what kind of permanent place it wanted to be. This transition was not always smooth. There were businesses that closed and people who left, and a period in which the future of the town was genuinely uncertain. Joseph navigated this with the same steady, practical competence he brought to everything, working with the town council to attract the kind of investment that would sustain a settled community rather than a transient one. A second church was built, a post office expansion. The school got a second room added, which was Frances Bly's particular project, and which Wilhelmina organized the fundraising for with the focused efficiency of a woman who had been managing limited resources since childhood and knew exactly how to make them stretch. The Randall Coat matter concluded in 1887. The territorial courts, moving at their characteristic pace, rendered a judgment that required the return of the Harlan land and two other parcels acquired under similar circumstances, and levied fines that were significant enough to establish the pattern as costly. Randall did not go to prison, which Wilhelmina had made her peace with, and he left Caldwell and did not return, which she thought was probably better for everyone including him. She did not feel triumphant about it. She felt something quieter, which was the particular settling sensation of an injustice being acknowledged even if imperfectly remedied. She told Joseph about it that evening while Thomas slept in his room and the house was quiet, and he listened and nodded and said, "Ruth Harlan gets her land back. That's the part that matters." "Yes," she said, "that's the part that matters." They sat on the porch in the June evening, with the last light going from the sky and Sargent asleep at their feet, which was the image of their life together in its plainest and most accurate form. And she thought about the full distance between the woman who had arrived on a train in June of 1884 with $20 and a hollow arrangement, and the woman sitting here now. And the distance was enormous and specific, and traversed not by luck, but by a series of choices made under pressure, toward the better thing rather than the easier one. She looked at her husband's profile in the fading light, the reliable angular face that she now knew completely, all its expressions and its silences and its honest communications, and she thought that there was no circumstance under which she would have traded the route she had taken, fainting and all. "Joseph," she said. He said. "Thank you for moving," she said. He turned to look at her. The gray-green eyes in the last light were warm. "Thank you for opening your eyes," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and the Kansas summer evening settled over them like something benedictory, and Sargent shifted in his sleep. And inside the house, Thomas made the small sound he made when he was dreaming, which they had both learned meant he was fine and did not need anything. The years moved. Caldwell grew smaller in the particular way that frontier towns grew smaller as the frontier moved west, but it also grew more itself, more settled and layered and inhabited. The school became the thing Wilhelmina had known it could be, a genuine institution rather than a seasonal arrangement, and she and Frances Bly between them educated two full generations of Caldwell children in mathematics and reading and geography, and the hard, useful truth that knowing things was better than not knowing them. Joseph continued as marshal for 4 more years, until 1890, when the changing nature of the region and the declining violence of the cattle era made the full-time position redundant, and the town council, with genuine regret and significant ceremony, reorganized the law enforcement to a smaller scope. He was not displaced by this. He was 40 years old and had built enough of a reputation that the county offered him a position as a land commissioner, which was less dramatic and more paperwork, and suited him perfectly well because the paperwork involved ensuring that property records were clean and legitimate, and that the kind of thing that had happened with Randall Coat could be identified and addressed before it became the kind of problem that required a marshal. Thomas was 4 when Joseph shifted to the county job, and noticed the change mainly in that his father was home more and at more predictable hours, which Thomas strongly approved of because it meant more time with the blocks and the educational games that Wilhelmina provided, and the long walks along the creek that had become the family's particular form of Sunday ceremony. In 1889, the second child arrived. Another boy, born in January, delivered safely and loudly, and named Daniel after Wilhelmina's grandfather on her mother's side, a choice that had required no negotiation, Because Joseph had held the family history she had given him with the same care he held everything she trusted him with. Daniel was, from the first weeks, an entirely different creature than Thomas. Where Thomas had been quiet and concentrated, Daniel was immediate and exuberant, and had opinions about everything and the volume to communicate them. He was 3 weeks old when he first made Thomas laugh by absolute accident, and Thomas, who was 3 at the time, looked at his brother with the expression of someone who has just discovered something irreversibly wonderful, and neither parent was ever quite the same about that moment. The house that had been Joseph's plain rental became, over the years, layered with the accumulated artifacts of a full life. There were curtains and a kitchen garden, and a second good chair at the table that had become 4 chairs and a larger table. There was a bookshelf that had started as Wilhelmina's teaching materials and expanded until it occupied an entire wall of the sitting room and contained, among other things, a worn copy of Robinson Crusoe that Thomas read until the spine gave out, and a French grammar primer that Daniel showed no interest in whatsoever, but that Wilhelmina kept for the sake of her own memory. There was a photograph, taken in 1888 by a traveling photographer who set up in Caldwell for a week, of the 4 of them in the backyard of the house. Thomas is standing very straight with the serious face he had at 2 years old, and has not entirely lost by the time he is 40. Daniel does not yet exist in 1888. Joseph is standing with one hand on Wilhelmina's shoulder, and she is sitting with Thomas on her lap, and she is not quite smiling, but her eyes carry the warmth of someone at the center of exactly where they belong. That photograph hung in the schoolhouse from 1889 onward, not as an advertisement or a sentiment, but because Wilhelmina had put it there one morning, and it had stayed there, and it became one of the things that Caldwell children saw every school day for 20 years, and associated with the idea of what it meant to make a home in a difficult place with honest intent. Clara Dunbar remained their closest friend through all of it, the woman who had brought water on a church step, and who had never required any explanation for what had happened between the marshal and the teacher, because she had seen it herself with the clear eyes of someone who paid attention to what people actually did in crisis moments rather than what they said afterward. She was godmother to both boys and the kind of person who appeared at the right moment with practical help before being asked, which was a quality she shared with Joseph and which Wilhelmina had come to believe was one of the essential marks of a good character. The decade turned. The century turned, with less fanfare in Caldwell than in larger places, the way large historical moments always land more quietly in small towns where people have work to do regardless of what the calendar says. Thomas was 14 in 1900, a serious young man with his mother's sharp mind and his father's measured way of moving through the world, already making clear that he intended to study law. Daniel was 11 and showed every sign of becoming either an excellent rancher or a tremendous amount of trouble, and possibly both, which seemed to delight him. Wilhelmina at 42 was exactly the person she had been at 26, and also completely different, which is the only honest way to describe what life does to a person when it is lived with intention. She still taught. She still made lists. She still ate breakfast every morning without exception. She had gray in her dark hair and lines at the corners of her eyes, and she considered both of these things with the same practical equanimity she considered most things. Joseph at 47 had a few more gray lines in his hair, and had put on the additional steadiness of a man who had spent 2 decades being reliable, and found that it had settled into him permanently. He had read most of Wilhelmina's bookshelf at this point, some of it twice, and their conversations over dinner had the particular quality of 2 people who have been genuinely interested in each other's minds for 15 years and have not run out of things to be interested in. He still sometimes brought her firewood she had not asked for. She still sometimes handed him peppermint drops at moments he found inexplicably sustaining. Some things are not habits. Some things are their own language, built up over time between two specific people, decipherable only to them. In the spring of 1901, something unexpected and entirely welcome happened. Thomas came home from his studies in Wichita for a visit and brought a young woman named Adeline Morse, who was the daughter of a schoolteacher from Topeka and had been studying alongside Thomas in the legal reading program, which was the most accessible form of legal education available to people who were not independently wealthy. Adeline was 20, had her mother's profession clearly in her blood, and had opinions about property law that she delivered with a directness that made Wilhelmina look at her within the first 5 minutes of meeting her, and then look at Joseph, and say nothing that was not in her eyes. Thomas, for all his seriousness, was in a state that both parents recognized and were too fond of him to comment on directly, which was the state of a young person in the full specific earthquake of being sincerely in love for the first time. Joseph took Thomas fishing the next morning, which was his method of having important conversations, and Wilhelmina took Adeline to the school, which was hers. What they each said in their respective conversations was private, but the result was visible in both Thomas and Adeline at dinner that evening, which was a kind of settled ease that had not been there the day before. Relationships that have the right foundations tend to recognize themselves when people stop being in the way. That summer, Caldwell held a picnic for the 4th of July with the particular combination of patriotism and food and fireworks that was the American frontier's best tradition, and the Shelby family attended in full, Thomas and Adeline sitting together under the cottonwood trees, while Daniel ran around making the kind of controlled chaos that 11-year-olds excel at, and Joseph and Wilhelmina sat in their camp chairs side by side watching all of it with the warmth of people who have arrived, fully and at last, at the life they intended. She reached over at some point in the July evening, while the fireworks were beginning to paint the Kansas sky in colors that rivaled the August lightning she remembered from years before, and she took his hand the way he had once taken hers along the frozen creek, simply and without announcement, and he held it the way he always held it, which was as though it was the most natural thing in the world, and also something he had not stopped being grateful for since the first time. "Do you ever think about it?" She said, "The church step." "Sometimes," he said. "What do you think about?" she said. He considered this for a moment in the skylit dark. "I think about the fact that I almost did not go that day," he said. "The Harlan note was there and the timing was right, but I was standing at the office door in the morning and I almost stayed. And then I thought about 60 people standing in a churchyard and no one with their eyes open the right way, and I went." "I am very glad you went," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day since I have been glad I went." The fireworks climbed and broke above them, and Daniel made a noise of pure delight, and Thomas said something to Adeline that made her laugh, and Sargent, who was very old now and moved slowly but had not missed a single family gathering in his considerable lifetime, lifted his head at the sound of the fireworks, and then settled it back down on his paws with the philosophical acceptance of a dog who has long ago made his peace with the inexplicable habits of humans. Wilhelmina looked up at the sky and thought about all the paths that had brought her to this exact place in this exact August, the letter she had almost not written, and the advertisement she had almost not answered, and the church steps and the marshal who had moved, and she understood that the particular shape of her life, its difficulties and its grace and its honest unexpected happiness, had been made not by destiny or luck, but by a long series of choices made under pressure toward the better thing. She had chosen to walk the horse to the next post. She had chosen to go to the marshal's office that morning. She had chosen time when it was offered, and had chosen the Sunday walk, and had chosen the blue dress over the white one. She had chosen to be exactly who she was in a place that had not initially made space for her, and in doing that she had eventually helped make the space itself larger. And Joseph Shelby had chosen, on a morning in August of 1884, to walk 20 feet across a churchyard and kneel on the wooden steps, because someone needed a person to move, and he was the kind of man who moved, and the rest of everything had followed from that single choosing. She squeezed his hand and he squeezed back, and the fireworks went on above them, and the summer night was warm and full, and in every direction Caldwell, Kansas, spread out around them under the July sky, imperfect and real and theirs. Later, walking home with Daniel asleep against Joseph's shoulder and Thomas and Adeline walking ahead of them under the stars, she said, "Do you know what I think the most important thing is, in all of it?" "Tell me," he said. "That you moved," she said. "Not because it was your job. You moved because you were the kind of person who moves. And that was the only thing that started any of it." He looked at her over Daniel's sleeping head with the gray-green eyes that had not changed in 17 years, and he said, "And you opened your eyes, and said your own name back to me, and walked that horse to the next post, and came to my office, and asked me to walk on a Sunday, and made this." He shifted Daniel slightly and looked around at Thomas and Adeline and the town and the sky. "All of this." She stopped walking for a moment and looked at him. This man she had built a life with from the ground up in a hard and gorgeous country, and she thought that she would spend the rest of her years being glad that she had opened her eyes on a church step and found him there. "Come home," she said. "I'm already there," he said. "Whenever you are." And they walked home together through the July dark, their younger son asleep in his father's arms and their older son walking toward his own future ahead of them, and the stars above the Kansas plains burning clean and distant and ancient, as they always had and always would. In the years that followed, the story of the marshal and the teacher became one of those stories that small towns keep, retelling it at different times with different emphases depending on what the moment needs, but always with the central fact intact. When she fainted at the church door, the marshal was the only one who moved, and from that one movement everything good in both their lives had followed. Thomas Shelby did become a lawyer, practicing in Wichita, and he married Adeline Morse in 1903 in a ceremony at the First Presbyterian Church of Caldwell, where both his parents cried without apology, and the following year brought a grandson named Joseph William Shelby who had, as Wilhelmina noted with great satisfaction, his grandfather's eyes and his grandmother's already decided expression. Daniel, who had been both rancher and trouble as predicted, settled into a life on the land south of town with a competence and a cheerfulness that made everyone around him better, and he came for Sunday dinners with the reliability of a person who understands that the table is where family happens, and he brought increasingly interesting things from his ranch that he described with the particular enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loves his work. Sargent died in the autumn of 1902, very old and greatly loved, and was buried under the oak tree in the backyard that Joseph had planted the first spring of their marriage, and both of them were more affected by this than they were entirely prepared for, and they sat on the porch that evening with the particular grief of losing someone who had been present for nearly the whole of the life they had built. And they held hands and remembered him properly and talked about all his specific qualities until they were both capable of smiling again. Joseph retired from the county commission in 1905 at 54, in the way that men who have been useful their whole lives retire, which is to say not entirely, because there was always something that needed attending to and he attended to it. He sat on the school board. He helped Thomas with legal questions about land rights and property records. He chopped firewood for people who needed it without being asked. He read. He walked with Wilhelmina along the creek on Sunday afternoons as they had always done, the path more familiar now than any other place either of them knew, worn smooth by years of their particular footsteps. She retired from the school in 1907, and Frances Bly, who had been her colleague for 20 years and was now effectively running the school with the authority and competence that Wilhelmina had always known she had, thanked her at the farewell gathering with a speech that made the whole room cry except for Wilhelmina herself, who managed to keep her composure through it while squeezing Joseph's hand under the table with the force of someone who is not going to cry in public, even if it requires structural support. She began writing after she retired. She had always written lists and letters and lesson plans, but now she wrote longer things, accounts of the early days in Caldwell and the school, and the transformation of the territory, factual history, with the precise economical prose of a teacher who had spent decades refusing to waste words. The local newspaper ran her pieces, and they were read widely and reprinted in Topeka and Wichita. And she received letters from women all over Kansas who had their own versions of the forced choices and the hollow arrangements and the daily work of making yourself legible in a world that would prefer you were not. Joseph read everything she wrote before it went to the printer, not to approve it, but because he was the person she trusted with the first draft, the version before it was finished, and he always gave her honest observations rather than comfortable reassurance, which was the most loving thing he could have done with the work. In their quiet evenings, in the house that was now fully theirs in every sense, with the bookshelf wall and the curtains at every window, and the kitchen garden that had expanded to include herbs and 2 apple trees that were now old enough to produce reliably, they lived with the particular richness of people who have not wasted the time they were given. They were not, and had never been, a story of grand gestures or dramatic rescues or the kind of love that operates through spectacle. They were a story of 2 people who had each arrived at a crossroads carrying something difficult and had chosen, at the critical moment, to be honest about it, and had found in each other someone who met that honesty with its equal. She had fainted at a church door. He had moved when no one else had. From those 2 things, from the faint and the movement and all the honest choices that followed, they had built a life that was real and lasting and deeply, specifically, irreplaceably theirs. And every year, on the day in August that was closest to the anniversary, Joseph would bring her a small paper packet of peppermint drops without comment, and she would accept them without comment, and they would sit on the porch of their house in the Kansas evening with the wide sky above them and the sound of their town around them, and they would be, in the plain, simple fact of it, everything the other one needed. That was the whole of it. That was all, and it was enough, and it was more than either of them had once known to ask for. The double oak doors of the First Presbyterian Church of Caldwell stood for another 40 years after that August morning, and the step where she had fallen was worn smooth by decades of parishioners arriving and departing, and no one who crossed it in those years did so without knowing the story, without feeling in some small way the weight of what had happened there and the grace of what had followed. When she had fainted at the church door, the marshal was the only one who moved. Everything that mattered began with that.